turn the lights down and just put this on. It's right behind you. Johan.
There's nothing this parliament can do. With or without you, people are going to occupy land. We require no permission from you, from the president, from no one. We don't care. We can do whatever you want to do. Who are you to tell us whether we can occupy land or not? We are going to occupy land. South Africa, occupy land. That's who we are. We can withdraw my membership from this useless parliament.
Yes, honorable member. Must never be scared to kill. A revolution demands that at some point there must be killing, because the killing is part of a revolutionary act. Shoot to kill. Namaza. Kill the poor, the farmer. Kill the poor, the farmer.
Welcome to A Deep Dive. We're jumping right into, well, a really remarkable and pretty intense exchange that happened recently at the White House. It involved former President Trump and South African President Ramaphosa.
Yeah, quite a meeting.
Exactly. And the material we're using for this dive, it comes from excerpts from a Sky News YouTube transcript. It really captures the back and forth of this high-stakes conversation. So our mission today is really to cut through some of the noise, unpack what was actually said, the big allegations that were made, and importantly, the responses. We're focusing particularly on all the claims around the safety, the treatment of white farmers in South Africa.
And what's really striking about this transcript is just how raw it seems. It wasn't like a prepared statement or a formal press conference. It felt very unexpected, a really direct confrontation, pretty much from the word go.
It really did kick off dramatically. I mean, leaning didn't just ease in. It started with former President Trump showing videos right away.
Straight out of the gate.
Yeah. And these videos were pretty potent. One apparently showed political figures that were identified as leaders from the EFF and Kanto Sizwe parties.
Right. It's important to note, prominent minority opposition groups in South Africa, they're separate from the ruling government party.
Okay. And in these videos, one speaker was quoted calling to kill the white farmer. Others talked about occupying land without permission, saying things like, we require no permission from you, and we don't care. There was even footage described as, well, dancing in parliament related to this.
Provocative stuff.
And then he showed another video. This one was described as showing burial sites allegedly of white farmers. The description mentioned approximately 1,000 white crosses, lines of cars paying respects. It was described as looking terrible.
And leading with that kind of visual material right at the start, it immediately set a very specific, very confrontational tone for the whole meeting. It sort of anchored the discussion from the get-go on those really vivid, emotionally charged images and the claims they were meant to back up.
Yeah, absolutely. And former President Trump, he immediately tied these videos and also some documents he had, like articles about deaths, he tied them to these much broader claims.
Okay.
He claimed there was widespread killing, persecution, specifically targeting white farmers. He alleged that white South Africans are, quote, fleeing because of the violence and racist laws.
Racist laws.
Yeah.
That's strong language.
Very. He also claimed land was being confiscated without payment.
Yeah.
And that people were actually being executed when their land was taken, adding crucially that, quote, nothing happens to them, implying, impunity for the perpetrators.
Right.
He then made this incredibly strong comparison, saying the situation was, quote, the opposite of apartheid.
Wow. Given South Africa's history, that's a really stark phrase to use.
Definitely. He even mentioned thousands of people trying to emigrate to the U.S., to Australia, because they felt they, quote, are going to be killed and their land is going to be confiscated. And then he took aim at the U.S. media, specifically NBC, ABC, CBS, calling them fake news, because in his view, they weren't covering this issue.
So a really heavy opening salvo.
Mm-hmm.
How did President Ramaphosa respond to all that?
Well, according to the transcript, his response was immediate. He tried to kind of shift the framing, bring in more context, more facts as he saw them.
Okay.
He was apparently very clear, stating that the people in those videos, they were leaders of those minority opposition parties we talked about,
Right.
explicitly not part of his government.
Right, distancing his administration.
Exactly. He emphasized that the official South African government policy is, quote, completely against the things being said in those speeches, even if they happened in parliament.
Okay, so he was highlighting the difference between political rhetoric, even in parliament, and actual government policy.
Yes, he made the point that South Africa's multi-party democracy allows for diverse, sometimes, extreme views expressed, but that doesn't mean it's government policy or action.
What about the land issue? That was a major accusation.
He tackled that head-on. He directly denied that the government allows land to be taken without consequence. He stated, pretty unequivocally, that the South African Constitution guarantees and protects land ownership sanctity for all citizens.
All citizens, okay.
He did acknowledge the constitutional right to expropriate land, but specifically for public use. And he added that this process hasn't, quote, really gotten underway in practice.
So a potential power exists, but it's not being widely used, according to him.
That seems to be his point.
Yeah.
And he also pushed back on the idea that only white farmers were victims. He said, look, crime is a serious problem. People do get killed, tragically. But the majority of crime victims in South Africa are actually black people.
So presenting it as a broader crime issue affecting everyone, not just one group.
Exactly. But it wasn't just Ramaphosa speaking for the South African side. There were other voices in the room that added more layers.
Oh, interesting. Who else?
The South African Minister of Agriculture was there, and he acknowledged point blank that there is a rural safety problem.
Okay, so an admission of the problem itself.
Yes. The minister said it requires more policing resources and a different strategy.
Yeah.
But, and this is important, he also stressed that the majority of farmers, both commercial and smallholder, actually want to stay in South Africa.
Despite the challenges.
Right. And he highlighted that farm attacks and also stock theft, which is, livestock theft, a huge economic hit, especially for smaller black farmers. These are being prioritized as serious crimes.
Okay, so focusing on specific crime types affecting rural areas.
Then you had perspectives from former President Trump's South African friends who were present. Golfers Ernie Els and Retief Goosen, and the businessman Johan Rupert.
Ah, yes. The golfers. What did they say?
Els and Goosen, they shared really personal stories, growing up in farming areas, knowing friends who'd been killed, family members attacked. Goosen mentioned his own 80-year-old mother being attacked.
Wow. Very personal accounts.
Very. They talked about the reality of farms being attacked, sometimes burned, essential equipment like water boreholes being stolen, living behind electric fences. It sounded, really tough.
Yeah.
But they also emphasized that farmers are still farming, they are committed to staying, they express this deep desire for things to improve, and specifically asked for U.S. support to help.
So acknowledging the severity, but also a commitment to staying and seeking help.
Yeah.
What about Rupert, the businessman?
Johan Rupert, he added his view. He first acknowledged that he himself is often a target of Mr. Malema, the EFF leader seen in one of the videos. He agreed, yes, there are too many deaths. But he stressed, like Ramaphosa and the ag minister, that the crime problem is across the board. It affects everyone, not only white farmers.
Okay, reinforcing that broader perspective.
Yeah. He even made a comparison saying crime levels in SA reminded him of New York in the 1970s. And he pointed to the extremely high murder rate among gangs in the Cape Flats area of Cape Town as another example of widespread violence. His main pitch was for U.S. technological help. He mentioned Starlink, maybe for better rural communication, and drones for surveillance. And he really emphasized that supporting economic growth was key to tackling crime, linking it directly to inequality and massive unemployment.
Right, connecting the crime issue to deeper economic problems.
And there was one more key voice, a trade union leader, Ziggy Solos.
The labor perspective. What did she add?
She supported the government's efforts to work with business, stressing just how vital it was to grow the economy, attract foreign direct investment. She hammered home that 40% unemployment figure.
40%? That's staggering.
It really is. She argued that the lack of hope, the lack of jobs that fuels so many other problems, including crime. She talked about the U.S.-SA trade relationship, AJUA, mentioning 600 U.S. companies in SA, 500,000 South African jobs tied to U.S. exports, cars, agriculture, mining.
So highlighting the existing economic ties and the potential for growth. What was her take on the crime itself?
She acknowledged flat out, South Africa is a violent nation. But echoing Rupert and Ramaphosa, she reiterated, this is not necessarily about race. It's about the incredibly high levels of violence overall.
Okay.
She gave examples of horrific attacks, rape, murder, throats being slit, targeting Black elderly women in rural areas, specifically to show that this kind of violence is pervasive. It's not just one group being
A
targeted.
grim picture. but emphasizing its broad nature.
Yes. She also touched on porous borders contributing to crime, needing better documented entry. And she clarified something about recent land handover stories, saying some involved white farmers voluntarily donating land or willing buyer-willing seller deals, sometimes with the government paying above market value.
That's quite a different picture from land being simply confiscated without payment.
Exactly. It adds complexity.
So if you pull all those different South African voices together, the president, the ag minister, Rupert, Solos, what's the synthesis?
Well, it's fascinating. They all unanimously acknowledge the reality and severity of rural crime, including farm attacks. No one denied that.
Right.
But you see multiple speakers from different sectors consistently framing it more broadly. They present it mainly as this deep-seated general crime problem, fueled by complex socioeconomic issues, unemployment, inequality that hits everyone.
Which stands in pretty stark contrast to the initial framing presented by the former president, focusing on targeted racial violence or even, potentially, genocide.
Precisely. And you also see different solutions being proposed, right? More policing and tech versus the need for fundamental economic growth and investment.
And that word genocide, it actually came up directly, didn't it?
It did. A reporter specifically asked former President Trump if he'd made up his mind whether genocide is occurring in South Africa.
And his response?
According to the transcript, he said he hadn't made up his mind, but that his motivation was wanting to save lives globally. And it's probably worth mentioning here, the Sky News reporter, in their wrap-up at the end of the transcript, explicitly described that claim, the genocide of white farmers, which they attributed to the former president and also Elon Musk as being widely discredited.
Right. So that context was provided in the source material itself.
Yes.
Stepping back a bit, this whole exchange, it wasn't just about farm safety in isolation, was it? It seems tied into the broader U.S.-South Africa relationship.
Absolutely. You have South Africa hosting the upcoming G20 summit and then handing the presidency over to the U.S. That context looms large.
And President Ramaphosa actually invited the former president to visit South Africa for the G20.
He did. The transcript shows him extending that invitation, framing the U.S. as this key partner, a leader in the G20. It felt like an attempt to, keep the relationship on track despite the confrontation.
And underlying that was a clear plea from the South Africans for U.S. support, wasn't there?
Definitely. Across the board, technological help for policing, yes, but crucially, investment. Investment to grow the economy, tackle that unemployment crisis.
The argument being that this kind of support would strengthen the SA government's hand, help them push back against extremist elements, and actually get a grip on the crime situation.
Exactly. And the former president, for his part, indicated that resolving the issues he raised was important for the future of that relationship. So, linkage there too.
So reflecting on all this, what really stands out to you from this deep dive into the transcript? It's such a complex picture, isn't it? These incredibly conflicting accounts, different interpretations of the same, undoubtedly difficult reality, all packed in one meeting.
Yeah, it really lays bare that fundamental tension, doesn't it? You have the allegations from one side, targeted violence, land confiscation against a specific group.
Right.
And then you have the South African government and others saying, yes, crime is severe, horrifically so, but it affects all citizens. And it's rooted in these broader issues, unemployment, inequality. And the solution they're seeking is partnership, investment.
It's just a really powerful illustration of how these complex national issues get framed, get debated, often fiercely, on the international stage. You see personal stories colliding with national statistics, with political narrative.
Absolutely. This whole interaction, it captures a country really grappling very openly with violent crime, huge economic challenges, the weight of its own history, sharp internal political divides.
All while trying to seek international understanding and support, but also having to defend its own reality, its own approach against some really serious accusations.
So maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over, based on what we've heard from the source material today. When you hear these very different accounts of the violence in South Africa, think about the contrasting ideas presented about its primary cause. Is it fundamentally, as alleged by some in that room, a racially motivated campaign? Or is it primarily, as argued by the South African government and others present, a symptom of these deep socioeconomic problems and just pervasive general criminality that affects people pretty much regardless of race?
And what is that difference in the perceived root cause? What does that imply about the most effective ways for countries like the U.S. or the international community generally to engage with and support South Africa moving forward?